Hello everyone and welcome to the Music Professor channel. I'm Matthew King and I'm assisted in today's video by Loki, my cockapoo. A couple of people in a recent video said they didn't like to see a dog in a presentation of this kind, and I hope that's not the case generally. Let me know if you feel that way, but I like having him here. He kind of brings something to the discussion. He doesn't bring very much intellectually, but he brings his presence, which I appreciate. So just to say a few things, if you like the channel, please subscribe. And if you really like the channel, please consider becoming a patron. And the details are below in the video description. The other thing is, what's another criticism we've had recently? That the lecture format is too lectury for YouTube. I mean, I get the impression that our videos are doing quite well, so I'm not really bothered about that. The purpose of this channel is to introduce people to all sorts of exciting musical topics. Some of them are quite kind of complex and we have to go into things in detail. But do let me know what you think. If you're just here because you just want to watch a quick video, this probably isn't the program for you, in which case don't watch. But I know that most of you are keen people and it's brilliant that you watch the show. We really appreciate it. So today's discussion is about Glenn Gould. First thing to say about Glenn Gould is he was a genius. He was a charismatic Canadian pianist and musical thinker. In his own way, a rather brilliant presenter of TV and radio shows in the 1960s and 70s. And really a phenomenal musician in all sorts of ways. So that's the first thing to say about Glenn Gould. Fascinating person. Famously eccentric for all sorts of reasons, not least because his performing was eccentric. He did things that other people didn't do. You might say he dared to do things that other people didn't do. And his interpretations of Bach are particularly famous because of all those reasons, but also because they kind of cast a certain kind of light on Bach, a certain perspective on Bach, which hadn't been cast before. He's really responsible in many ways for de-romanticising Bach and the way that people perform Bach in the era before sort of historically informed performance practice. So he's a really essential figure, I think, for all those reasons. I think listening to his Bach performances now, they are kind of their era and eccentric, but fascinating. I know on YouTube, actually, there's quite a big debate about this, about whether Gould's any good. I would say, no, he's amazing, but he's kind of weird. And that's perhaps some of that is what genius is, isn't it? Genius is a little bit eccentric. So we put up with these things. Today, I'm going to have a big kind of argument with Gould about Mozart, because I just think he gets Mozart completely wrong. And I think it would be quite fun to have a little back and forth with Gould about Mozart. So that's what we're going to do. Here we go. So we're going to go in, just plunge straight in. I've got my iPad here. I'm watching Gould and we'll just see what he has to say. The original show was called On How Mozart Became a Bad Composer, or Return of the Wizard. I'm not even sure why it has that second title, but one of you will tell me, no doubt. But How Mozart Became a Bad Composer is the thesis of the discussion. I love the fact that in mainstream TV in those days, he'd have a show with this kind of topic. I kind of miss that sort of thing. It's a shame that TV nowadays doesn't. Okay, so let's have a look at what Gould has to say. First of all, he's playing the piano and he's playing the Mozart C minor concerto in particular. But weirdly, he's not playing the opening of the concerto. He's playing what we would call a second subject group, which consists of quite a lot of sequential writing. Gould's an amazing pianist. I can't pretend that I love the way he's playing Mozart. There's something ever so slightly mechanistic about it. I almost think that's deliberate, but we'll get onto that in a minute. There's a curious discrepancy when I'm watching Gould play.
Came from Mozart's.
He's actually about to start talking about. There's a curious discrepancy when you're watching Gould play, which is, and this is before we listen to what he has to say, he seems to be enjoying it more. You can tell because he's doing his usual humming and sort of waving his head around and kind of into it, which I think belies the fact that he's going to make a whole argument against the music. And that's just me noticing a kind of musical discrepancy between his own intuitive musical response to it and his sort of cerebral response. He's convinced himself he doesn't like Mozart, so even though when he's playing it, he realizes he kind of does like it, even though he sort of does on some other level. He's decided he doesn't. And then he goes in with his argument.
That example came from Mozart's piano concerto in C minor. one of the last works he produced in that form, one of only two in a minor key, and perhaps for both those program noteworthy reasons, a work that's had a rather better press than it deserves, I think. Despite its gently swooning melodies, its meticulously balanced cadences, despite its stable and architecturally unexceptionable form, I'm going to submit it as a good example of why I think Mozart, especially in his later years, was not a very good composer.
Okay, so there's something to take issue with. I mean, there's a contrivance here. He's played us a curious passage from the C minor concerto in that he's sort of given us a filler section, magnificent filler, which I'm going to try to explain why I think it is magnificent. But what he's neglected to say, he's mentioned these two minor key concertos, but goodness me, they're extraordinary. And he's missed out the fact that the C minor concerto begins with this amazing brooding. You don't even know that you're in C minor. Is it A flat major? Because we go to A flat first, and then we do this. Very characteristic Mozartian rhythm. And then the woodwind comes in. This fantastic augmented sixth. I mean, could you begin a concerto better than that? It's fantastic. Neapolitan. Okay, so it's fantastic, but he's neglected to play that bit, which I think is significant. Also because the opening of the concerto gives you the primary material, which everything subsequently is in some sense developing in this beautiful and imaginative way, but he doesn't say any of that. So I think he's already sort of removing the information we kind of need to establish that this is a masterpiece without very much debate. But there we go, that's what he's doing. Okay, let's press on and hear the next thing.
Exceptionable form. I'm going to submit it as a good example of why I think Mozart, especially in his later years, was not a very good composer.
Right, so he just made the case that Mozart in his later years, he seems to think that Mozart when he was a teenager or in his very early 20s or something was good, but then became lazy. I think obviously we won't have time to hear everything he says, but he seems to equate that with the fact that Mozart was a brilliant improviser and therefore his facility got in the way. It's that old chestnut where people go, well, if the composer has too much facility, people often say this about Mendelssohn, too much facility means that there's something easy and they don't bother and there's a laziness that creeps in or a smugness or that kind of argument. I don't think it's true in the case of Mendelssohn or Mozart. I think both of them are composers capable of really fantastic work and really putting in the effort as well. But the thing about improvisation anyway is that there tends to be this attitude. You even see it with the way that people discuss jazz, you know, as if it's some sort of minor genre because it's improvisatory. But the truth is all great composers come out of an improvising tradition. In a recent video about Wagner's Tristan and Isolde, we discussed how Wagner was trained in partimento and could sort of work stuff out at the keyboard. And we know that Bach was an amazing improviser. I mean, no one accuses Bach of being a lazy composer. Beethoven was an amazing improviser. Very few people say that he was a lazy composer, so I just don't think it makes any sense. That's just to immediately dismiss the bulk of Gould's thesis, which is it's to do with improvisation. Well, I don't see that's true. Okay, on he goes with his main statement here.
But the italics are squarely on that word composer because Mozart was unquestionably a very great musician, and I'm not being coy when I try to foster that distinction. By the evidence of his contemporaries, he was a superlative performer and an improviser of note. By the evidence of our own eyes and ears, a resourceful craftsman in the theatre, and in all the familiar musical forms of his day, an exhilaratingly dependable artist who could knock out a divertimento the way an accounts executive dispatches an inter-office memo. But in a way, that's his problem. Too many of his works sound like inter-office memos.
Okay, well, I mean,
they're pertinent.
That is just not true. Name me a piece of notes that sounds like an inter-office memo. That's amazing. I mean, for example, let me give you Exhibit A. He says that Mozart could knock out a divertimento like an inter-office memo. Well, most of you will remember the great scene in Amadeus when Salieri walks into the... I'm not saying Amadeus is true, but in some ways it reveals something. The bit where Salieri walks into a ballroom, everyone's kind of, I think, standing around talking or drinking or whatever. There's a wind wind ensemble playing Mozart's Grand Partita, his great serenade for 13 wind instruments, or for 12 wind instruments and bass. And they're playing the great adagio from that piece. So there's a wind divertimento. What could be less like an office memo than Salieri says that it's like I think he describes it as a squeeze box or something.
Like a rusty squeeze box.
The rhythm, this thing, and then the famous oboe. I'm not playing it exactly right because I'm kind of improvising it, but and then the clarinet comes in. So you get these effortlessly, they sound effortlessly beautiful crossing over of instrumental parts in this dialogue. Perhaps the essence of Mozart's genius, by the way, is that kind of operatic thing he has as a natural opera composer, where every instrument sounds like a character and they're all talking to each other. So when you listen to his music, you're drawn into this conversation. It's amazingly communicative. And it's odd, isn't it, that some people don't really get Mozart. Gould's one of them, because for them music isn't like that. For him it's much more sort of brainy. With Mozart, I think although Mozart is brainy, I think the way he communicates is much more like speech, like some kind of human interaction. But we'll get into more of that in a minute. I've put the iPad on the floor, so I'm going to pick it up.
And in that example, I think Mozart was dictating just such a memo. He held that series of rather undistinctive and virtually indistinguishable E-flat major themes together with listless scale runs and predictable chord changes. Guess what came after that? Like an executive holding forth upon the ramifications of a subject that no one in the front office was much concerned with anyway. Yeah, well, Harry, as I see it, JB's got this thing about replacing the water cooler. Let's just file it and forget it.
Okay, so he's so brilliant because he manages to play Mozart quite badly there so that it sounds boring. And then he says that it's like an inter-office memo where people are just talking boringly to each other. It's sort of a brilliant thing that he's doing, but it's all nonsense. And the reason why it's nonsense, let's have a look at it. So the bit that he's taken exception to, and first of all, I should say the piano initially, after all that wonderful C minor orchestral material that we looked at the start, so it's this wonderful melancholic thing with the right hand playing these, like a soprano really. And then sort of almost a throbbing. And then the orchestra comes in. So fantastically dynamic interaction between the orchestra and the piano. I think Mozart gets it right where very few composers get it right, where the relationship between the orchestra and the piano does not have to be this massive sort of Brahmsian conflict. I'm not meaning to have a go at Brahms. Beethoven does it too, where you've got a massive orchestra and the pianist is trying to sort of overpower the orchestra in some way, and they're kind of locked in a dynamic conflict. It doesn't have to be like that, and for Mozart it never is. It's this interactive exchange between them, very often the piano representing in some way an intimate form of expression as opposed to the more kind of grandly rhetorical character of the orchestra. So the passage that he picks out there, which is this. Okay, so Loki. When I was a teenager, one of my favourite composers was a wonderful French, living in those days, a living French composer called Olivier Messiaen. And most of you will know who he was, a sort of mystical, extraordinary French composer obsessed with birdsong and setting mystical or religious things in a really kind of fervent and exciting way. Fantastic composer. For Messiaen, Mozart was his most important composer. And I was always struck by this because he said the key thing with Mozart, something Gould doesn't mention, but for Messiaen, the thing with Mozart is rhythm. And this passage, in a sense, is all about rhythm. You've got, for example, the first phrase, which has these, what I would call trochaic rhythms, in other words, long, short, where you're aware of this 1, 2, 3, one of the third beat has this marvelous expressive turn, and also the shift to the diminished chord and back to the dominant seventh. Seems a simple thing. It isn't simple. It's magnificent. Well, maybe it is, because in Mozart, the essence of it is something incredibly sophisticated with the appearance of simplicity. So you've got this thing that seems simple. And then we have a hemiola, by which I mean 1, 2, 3. Do you see the emphasis on that E flat, which comes in on the second beat of that fourth bar? But it's really a slow 3. 1, 2, 3. And then the next phrase, up the circle of fifths. So we started in B flat major, now we're in E flat. And you notice how he begins the scale there on a lower part of the scale, so it hits an F, just a tone above the E flat in the previous scale. That went to the E flat, this one goes to the F, so you're aware of a long range movement from the E flat to the F. And let's see what he does with the third phrase. And then he hits the F on the first beat, so he disrupts that hemiola rhythm. These are subtle things, but they make the whole thing flow in a wonderfully expressive way. And then he moves from a trochaic rhythm to an iambic rhythm. So you go short, long, a harmonic rhythm, suddenly bar by bar, and now beat by beat. So it's as if the harmonic rhythm is increasing speed. It's a typical Mozart thing. It's like an acceleration into this wonderful final accent, and then the cadence point. I mean, the whole thing rhythmically is so subtle and sophisticated and magnificent. He never mentions it. I don't think he really thinks about that. For him, these are just sequences. But do you see how things that seem like cliches, once they're fitted into a larger sense of why it's communicating so well, you start to realise, oh, well, anyway, what's wrong with sequences? What's wrong with the circle of fifths? These are all communicative ways of showing that you're moving towards something, that you're moving towards E flat major. From a relatively remote point, you're moving towards E flat major. One last thing to say about this amazing passage that Gould doesn't like, but I think is amazing, is that the orchestra, he doesn't mention the orchestra, but the orchestra behind it is doing this. First violins, it's fantastic, with this emphasis on the third beat. So you get the... Do you see that interaction between the first violins and the pianos in terms of the emphasis on the E flat? So that it again brings in a new kind of rhythmic, emphatic element, also very expressive because of the way he keeps emphasising that third beat. So the orchestra too is involved in this beautiful interaction of rhythmic elements.
Water cooler, let's just file it and forget it. But before we do that, let's hear some more of this famous Mozart concerto.
Oh, yeah.
This time played by my colleague, the distinguished British pedagogue, Sir Humphrey Price-Davies, who's...
Okay, so we got to the point where Gould brings in this other person, Sir Humphrey Price-Davies, who is in fact himself playing a kind of pompous English person, almost like, like me, sort of this kind of English fool, really, who's holding forth about Mozart as part of the tradition. Again, it's sort of charming because Gould is iconoclastic, so he's really having a crack at Mozart because in a way he's making a very important question, which is, are these so-called great artists great because society tells us so or tradition tells us so, or are they great because they really merit it? And that's a good question to ask. And it should be asked, and ask it of Mozart. See if the answer is yes. I don't think it is the case that Mozart isn't a great composer, but Gould seems to... See, Gould's kind of convinced himself. Has he convinced himself? He's keen for the purposes of the programme to set up this whole debate, which is kind of fun. Right, let's see what Sir Humphrey Price-Davies has to say. Right, so he has himself playing. Not very well, I have to say, the main second subject theme. But lots of pedal, which Gould doesn't normally employ.
Thank you, thank you. You're very kind, thank you. How well I remember Sir Joshua saying during my last year at the Academy, retain the C minor, start it up as you would the ninth or Gerontius, all the great pronouncements, and it will be a blessing in your later years.
So he's got this alter ego character saying these ridiculous things, pompous things about tradition and great works being stored up. So, we know what Gould is doing here. He's having a crack at that whole classical music thing of extolling the virtues of things without really explaining them. They're simply great works. I think all that is to be questioned and to be interrogated.
For some reason, despite all his experience and talent and facility, Mozart was content to set down in that piece, that purported late masterpiece, an appalling collection of clichés. Let's try to find out why. It's very difficult to define that word cliché and not get trapped by it. But I guess one definition would be a phrase or an idea which, through repeated use, has lost its point of view.
So yeah, Gould raises this issue about cliché, and he's right. It's an essential word, particularly with an artist like Mozart. But it's also essential when you're looking at, imagine we were doing a discussion about the Beatles, who I do want to look at some point. All sorts of clichés of the musical culture around them are being used, but used in an inspired way. So my point would be creativity, it doesn't eschew cliché, because music is full of clichés. It has to be. It can't communicate without them. If someone says write a tune in E flat, you're going to in the 18th century, you're going to come up with a formula, and it's going to have a cadence. That's what tunes do. They still do have cadences, not quite the same, but a melody has to have a cadence, which is a form of punctuation. So of course, clichés are there and they're present in everyone's music. It's not just Mozart, it's Bach, it's Haydn, it's Beethoven. Clichés are the material of music. As soon as Beethoven writes the Moonlight Sonata, which we've talked about a lot recently, he's got a second inversion triad. I mean, what could be more cliched to take a second inversion triad and just repeat it as an arpeggiated figure? But actually, the way he does it, the sonority of the instrument and the tempo and the journey that he takes that material on creates a masterpiece. Creates a poem, creates something magical. The character of music is that something magical happens. There might be a kind of dross-like surface that's made up of these things, but an artist of caliber will make something happen that somehow you didn't quite predict, you could never have imagined yourself. That's what Mozart does. So it's all very well Gould saying it's just the material of cliché. Of course it is. And Mozart, of all composers, knows that and makes use of the tropes of the classical style. But he spins gold out of the dross that nobody else can do much with. I mean, Haydn has a good go, and I love Haydn, but I can't think of any other of Mozart's contemporaries, Salieri or Stamitz or Hummel or Dussek. There are many composers, and they're all capable people, rather like Gould says, all fine craftsmen, all able to do things of interest, for sure. But Mozart does spin some gold out of the aspects of style that nobody else can really get to. Expressive gold, or a kind of thing that takes you, transports you when you listen to it. So he's now going to have a go at the material.
90% of the area after that, for 31 of 35 bars to be exact, Mozart ruthlessly exploited the sequence, his favorite time consumer.
Right, he's going to have a proper old go at Mozart's use of sequence, ignoring the fact that one of his favorite composers, Bach, uses sequences a great deal. Doesn't seem to bother Gould that Bach does it. For example, look at this passage from Brandenburg 5. So the keyboard's doing that, and it literally goes on and on doing this. And over the top of it, we've got a flute and a violin in this amazing, I have to say, canon, but just sort of turning thirds round round and round. Now look, I'm not saying Bach isn't wonderful. Of course he is, and actually this is one of my favourite passages because it is literally just this sense that he will take a sequence further than anyone else does. And it's like a picture of eternity with everything just turning and turning. It could go on forever. It's amazing. But from a certain point of view, if I was being like Gould, I could say it's just boring. It just feels mechanical. Do you see how one musical object can seem, perhaps to one observer, to be boring, and to another it can be revelatory? And maybe this is just a matter of perspective, except that perspective is really key. If, when you look at the composer's work, everything else around it, if that's boring too, you can then draw that conclusion, I suppose. But if the entire piece is fizzing with some sort of genius, and then it's got this curiously, what seems like a mechanical element in it, isn't it worth asking the question, is it mechanical? Am I perceiving it correctly? Or is there something interesting going on here? So now, let's go into this sequence that Gould's so hacked off about. Right, so here Gould's
that was the harmonic substance of the area immediately after that subject, and for 10 bars he did absolutely nothing except cover up in the most delinquent way with scales and arpeggios precisely those rather inane chords.
Is it inane?
That's all there was to that. And then having done that,
I mean, it's so crazy because he can say exactly the same about hundreds of passages, Bach. The passage he's talking about, so the orchestra's doing this. Yeah, we've got, he doesn't mention this lovely interaction, sort of canonic interaction with the bassoon doing this, canonic interaction between flute and clarinet. Was it flute and oboe? Reason why I don't know immediately is because Mozart doesn't indicate what the instruments are, flute and oboe. And then over the top of it, it isn't covering over anything. It's adding to this beautiful ensemble of glittering material. Well, it's so beautifully written because you've got these rhythmic elements inside the keyboard figuration that are just fizzing with energy. And they're not repeated. The second one, he could have gone, but he goes, so he's got this fantastic sense of variation. Next bit, I mean, beautiful. You've got the rising scale. Embedded inside it is a kind of canon. Do you see that? A canon in the right hand, but in the form of offbeat things. It's I mean, again, rhythmically, it's the second semiquaver is the first voice, second semiquaver, and then the third semiquaver is the answer. Second semiquaver, third semiquaver. I mean, rhythmically, astonishing. Left hand doing this rising. Okay, it would seem mechanistic, except that this is the very passage where he's also adding these other elements in the woodwind. So it's delicious. It's not padding. I'm not going to go into all the sequential passages that Gould criticises, but I think I've made the case that these aren't mechanistic things. They're not filler. Mozart's creating a beautiful surface of interactive elements with the most refined rhythmic elements within them, most refined rhythmic invention. And that is part of the reason why it has this beautiful sort of sizzling quality, a kind of energy. And that's why Mozart is so important, you know, because he's still relevant to us and he still communicates. It's not that he's a great musician. This is the thing. Gould says it's because he was a great musician, so it's okay. He was a great musician, wasn't a great composer. Who cares if he was a great musician? I mean, loads of great musicians in history who've then sort of passed away and we don't remember them. But that's not what it is with Mozart. It's very much an enduring kind of music to me, something that's as alive and meaningful now in 2024 as it was in the 1780s when he wrote it. And that's a definition of great art, I think. And that's why music matters, because it's literature. It's kind of got an enduring importance. Thank you for listening to the video, and we'll try and do a bit more Mozart just to flesh out some of these points in a future video.